Hello, welcome to Bite Size Med. This video is on the uterine or the endometrial cycle. The age at which the menstrual cycle starts, that's called menarche, and the cycles, they stop at menopause. In between these two phases, there are cyclical changes that happen in the ovary called the ovarian cycle. There are also changes in the uterus, and that's called the menstrual cycle itself or the uterine cycle. Both of these are under the influence of a hormonal cycle. What are those hormones? The hypothalamus, it produces a gonadotropin-releasing hormone, that's GnRH, which is produced in pulses at puberty, and that tells the anterior pituitary to produce the follicle-stimulating hormone, that's FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, that's LH. These act on the ovary at different points in the cycle and influence the ovaries. The ovaries, they produce estrogen and progesterone, which have effects on different organs. But for now, we're going to look at the changes that happen in the endometrium under the influence of this estrogen and progesterone, creating an endometrial cycle. For understanding, the cycle is considered to be 28 days, which is just an average. The actual cycle would be a range of days, but trying to understand what happens when the days keep varying can get a little confusing. So all the numbers used are just for understanding. The actual cycle isn't this clear-cut and varies from person to person and cycle to cycle. So we're going to put down day 0, day 14, and day 28. Here, the menstrual phase would be between day 0 and 4 or 5, so this would be the menstrual phase of this cycle, and after the 28 days would be the menstrual phase of the next cycle. In this 28-day cycle, ovulation happens 14 days before the menstrual phase. Before ovulation is the pre-ovulatory phase, and after ovulation is the post-ovulatory phase. The follicles of the ovary grow during the pre-ovulatory phase, and that's why this is called the follicular phase. Some of the primordial follicles, they grow and form primary follicles, then antral follicles, and one follicle, it dominates and matures into a Graafian follicle, while the others, they undergo atresia. The follicle, it has granulosa cells and theca cells, and they together form estrogen. The granulosa cells have FSH receptors. As the follicle grows, the number of granulosa cells increase, so the number of FSH receptors increases as well. FSH stimulates the aromatase enzyme, which is responsible for converting androgens formed in the theca cells to estrogen in the granulosa cells. So as the number of FSH receptors rises, the estrogen increases. And in the follicular phase of the cycle, estrogen will rise, while progesterone stays low. At ovulation, the mature follicle, it ruptures and releases the oocyte. The remaining cells, they form the corpus luteum, with the granulosa lutein cells and the theca lutein cells. These cells have more lipid, and they synthesize more progesterone than estrogen. So in the luteal phase of the cycle, the progesterone levels are higher than estrogen. The fate of the corpus luteum depends upon what happens to that oocyte that was released at ovulation. Does it get fertilized or not? If fertilization happens, then the corpus luteum would continue to grow and become the corpus luteum of pregnancy, maintaining the progesterone until the placenta takes over. If there's no fertilization, it'll grow for a while and then degenerate. It loses the yellow color and becomes a white scar called the corpus albicans. The estrogen and progesterone levels fall because it loses its secretory function. So estrogen dominated in the first half of the cycle and progesterone in the second. These hormones influence the endometrium, creating the endometrial cycle. First, let's look at the histological layers of the uterine wall. There's an endometrium, surrounded by a myometrium, and lastly, a perimetrium. In this diagram, I've split the layers just to make it easier to understand. The perimetrium is the serosa or the adventitia around it. The myometrium is smooth muscle. It's also got connective tissue and some vessels. But what's important for understanding the cycle is the changes in the endometrium. The endometrium has an epithelial lining, which is simple columnar epithelium. Below that is a lamina propria. The epithelium extends down into the lamina propria, forming glands. The uterus, it's supplied by uterine arteries. These arteries, they branch and they form arcuate arteries, radial arteries, but what we need right now are the straight arteries and the spiral or the coiled arteries. The straight arteries only extend to the basal layer of the endometrium, while the spiral arteries, they can extend up to the functional layer. So there's a stratum functionalis above and a stratum basalis below. What gets shed during menstruation is the stratum functionalis, leaving behind the stratum basalis. During the ovarian cycle, we saw that there was a follicular phase and a luteal phase. For corresponding changes that happen in the endometrium, the follicular phase would be the proliferative phase, and the luteal phase would be the secretory phase. The proliferative phase happens just after menstruation, so the first thing that the endometrium has to do is re-epithelialize. It has to replace what was lost or shed during menstruation. Remember, it's the stratum functionalis that gets shed, so what remains is the stratum basalis. It has the job of replacing what was lost. As the ovarian follicles grow, the estrogen levels, they rise. So under the influence of estrogen, the endometrium increases in thickness. The stratum functionalis is bigger than the stratum basalis. The glands, they are straight and deep, and the spiral arteries are more towards the lower part of the endometrium. So first it replaces what was lost, and then it increases in thickness by proliferation. This is the proliferative stage. After ovulation, the cells that remain in the ovarian follicle, they form the corpus luteum, which produces more progesterone than estrogen. This progesterone creates the secretory phase of the endometrial cycle. There's also estrogen being produced, and that causes the proliferation of cells a little, but there's more progesterone. And that prepares the endometrium for possible implantation of a blastocyst, assuming fertilization happens. So it's preparing the endometrium for implantation. The lining epithelium, it becomes secretory, so it hypertrophies. The glands, they become wider, longer, and more tortuous. They get filled with secretions, which are nutritive, because remember, it's preparing for the blastocyst. It's got things like glycogen. The lamina propria in the upper part, it's compact, and it's called the stratum compactum. But below that, it becomes fluid-filled and edematous. This is the stratum spongiosum. And these are the two parts of the stratum functionalis, the stratum compactum and the stratum spongiosum. The spiral arteries, they reach higher in the endometrium. Their walls thicken and they become more tortuous. So if fertilization takes place, then the endometrium is now prepared for the implantation of the blastocyst, and the corpus luteum would maintain the progesterone until the placenta takes over. But if there's no fertilization and the corpus luteum degenerates, it loses its secretory function, so the estrogen and progesterone levels drop. There's loss of that stimulating effect that these two hormones had on the endometrial lining, so it starts involuting, so its thickness reduces. The spiral arteries, they are sensitive to hormonal changes. Those spiral arteries that reach the surface, they become vasospastic. They constrict, reducing flow to the superficial tissue. What would that cause? Ischemia. So there's damage to both the stratum functionalis and the walls of the vessels. And when these vessels relax, blood leaks out through their damaged walls into the stroma. This causes those necrotic layers to separate and slough off. So the epithelium and the stroma of the stratum functionalis get shed along with the superficial glands and their secretions, which can also have blood in them. And all of this forms a part of the menstrual flow. The stratum functionalis getting sloughed off means that the stratum basalis is what's left behind, with its straight arteries. The basal layer is now left with that job of regenerating the sloughed off endometrium in the post-menstrual phase, which is the beginning of the proliferative phase, and then the cycle repeats again. So the ovarian and the endometrial cycle, they work together. If this video helped you, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.